Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I'm going to show you how I make handmade sketchbooks for soft pastels. So let's go over the supplies I'm going to be using to make my sketchbook. So first up, I'm going to be using the We Are Memory Keepers Cinch coil binding machine. This punches the holes into the paper and the cover. It allows you to line up your coils with your papers and then compress the coils to bind it all together. You don't have to use this method of binding. This is just what I'm going to be using. Then you need the whatever kind of coil or method you're going to use to bind it together. So I'm using Cinch coils. These are the Memory Keeper brand, but I've used other brands from Amazon, but this is what they look like close up. And this coil is what's going to be compressed together and act as a binding to hold all of our papers together. Then you need a dense cardboard for your covers. So this is a really dense corrugated cardboard that I used to use for shipping paintings, but you can use like cereal box cardboard. I would just double up the cardboard, so cut out, several pieces and glue them together so it's a little bit more rigid and sturdy. Then you need some kind of decorative paper to decorate your sketchbook with. So you can make this as colorful, as patterned, as muted, however you want your sketchbook to look. You have complete creative control for that. Then you have to use two other types of paper for your sketchbook, and these are really important. You have to have the paper that you want to draw on. So I'm using pastel matte paper. And then you need your Glassine paper. This is this shiny paper that you see. This paper prevents your pastel on your paper from transferring or getting smudged. So that paper is vital, and it is what separates a pastel sketchbook from a traditional sketchbook. I like to work with the pastel matte paper when I'm making sketchbooks because I like to use that paper to draw on anyways, and then it already comes with the Glassine. But you can order rolls of Glassine online pretty easily. You will also need something to cut your paper and your cardboard with. I'm going to be using this paper cutter. I've had it for over 10 years. It's really durable. It works great, but an exacto knife and a straight edge will work perfectly as well. Other supplies, I'm using a T-ruler, masking tape, scissors, a glue stick, Modge Podge. You really only need one type, exacto knife, pencil, and pliers with a wire cutting edge on the inside, and a paintbrush. A craft sponge does work better, so if you have that, use it. If you don't worry about it. I ended up not using my exacto knife as much as I did in the past, so it's kind of more of an optional supply as well. Packing tape is really helpful, so I would get some packing tape. And then I have these clips that I use when I'm painting, and I use them to hold the paper down while it's gluing, but you can just throw some heavy books on top of your paper while it's drying, and that will work. So let's get on to the assembly. So the first thing you need to do is decide what size of sketchbook do you want to make. Do you want to do a full sheet of paper? Do you want to do a half size, a quarter sheet, custom to how you paint and draw? That's the beauty of making a handmade sketchbook, is that you can make this however you want it to be. You just have to decide, and then you have to cut your paper to size and your Glassine to size. Because my pastel matte paper comes with Glassine, I am just taping each Glassine sheet to my pastel paper when I take it out. That way it stays together and it keeps things a little bit more organized, and I can keep my Glassine lined up with my paper, and I'll show you why that's important later. As I'm picking out colors, I am doing a variety of warm and cool colors, and I'm doing a variety of values. So some are darker and some are lighter, and that will just make a little bit more variety in my sketchbook, and that will make it more useful when I start painting. So I decided I wanted to do a half sheet sketchbook, so I'm going to be cutting each of these papers in half. So the paper itself is 24 centimeters by 30 centimeters, and I am cutting these down to be 24 centimeters by 15 centimeters. And if you're wondering why I'm measuring these out using a ruler and then cutting it instead of using the ruler that's on my paper cutter, it's because the 15 centimeter mark is in that clear dead zone with no markings. So I just manually measured it so that my papers could be the same width all the way across. Then I cut them. Now I am using half sheets, and so each paper color that I chose is going to actually be in my sketchbook twice because I'm cutting the papers in half. I also keep that in mind when I was choosing how many papers to pull out. So if I was going to be doing a full size sketchbook and not cutting these in half, I would have had 8 sheets in my sketchbook. I'd probably want more in my finished piece. But since I'm cutting these in half, now I have 16 pages in my sketchbook. I find with the size of binding ring that I'm using, I find the 16 is kind of the sweet spot. You can do 20 and that's not too shabby. But anything more than that, it's just too full and it makes it a little bit harder to fold the papers back. So I am taking my paper and I am kind of dividing it into 2 piles and alternating my colors so that when they're all stacked up, the colors and the values will be evenly dispersed throughout the stack. You can organize your paper and your colors however you want. But once I got those all stacked up, I set them to the side and now I am working on the cover. When you are making your cover for your sketchbook, you want it to be a little bit bigger than the papers that are going to be held inside. That way your cover can better protect your paintings inside your sketchbook. So again, my paper inside is going to be 24 centimeters by 15 centimeters. I am going to make my cover be 26 centimeters by 17 centimeters. Now, because of the way the coils line up the paper and the cover, I actually should have made my cover be something more like 25.5 centimeters by 17. And I'll show you why later on, but it's not the end of the world and it will be just fine. But you do want your cover to be a little bit bigger. Once you measure out the size you need, then you can cut it. I'm using my paper cutter for it because this is a super hardcore paper cutter and it can handle cutting the cardboard. If you don't have a paper cutter that can handle cutting cardboard, just use your exacto knife and your ruler. You just need them to be the same size and to be a little bit bigger than your final result. And you can, again, if you don't have thick, sturdy cardboard like this, you can double it up. So you can, sandwich 2 pieces of cardboard together, glue them together, and then use them as the cardboard insert for your sketchbook. Then once you have your cardboard cut out, then it's time to cut out your decorative paper that's going to make your sketchbook look all fancy. I decided to go for a 2-toned cover, meaning I want 2 different papers visible on my cover. So I'm going to show you how I do that. If you have a piece of paper that's big enough and you just want to keep it one pattern, then go for that. What you do need though is your paper you're going to be using needs to be quite a bit bigger than your cardboard cover insert because you need to have it be able to fold on the edges so that you can get a nice clean finish. So you want at least a 2 centimeter margin all the way around so that you can get nice clean folds. A 3 centimeter one would probably be a little bit better. So you can see I measured it out. I did about 1 centimeter and I was like, that should be all right, right? But I didn't take into account the depth of the cardboard and that it wouldn't give it enough fold to stay down easily, especially since the paper I'm working on is a cardstock, and it does make the covers a little bit trickier to make if you're working with a cardstock type of paper to wrap it in, just because it tends to pop up a little bit more and it's not as friendly. Now you can still get beautiful results with it, and I'm not trying to dissuade you, but you do need a little bit more folding margin if you're going to be using a thicker paper. And I'm going to be honest, I am a wing it type of person when I'm crafting, so then I come up with instructions after the fact. So you can see I measured out, realized I needed it to be a little bit wider, and then added some more margin to it. And then I folded it along my ruler just so I could get a nice straight edge on that one. And then I am just loading it up with glue. I'm being really, really generous. Now, something you can do is you can just use Modge Podge for this step and glue it down using the Modge Podge. You don't need the school glue. I didn't because between those 2 jars of Modge Podge, I had just enough to make this project if I didn't use it to glue it down. It would have been tight if I tried to glue it down using the Modge Podge. So I opted for the glue stick, and there's pros and cons with that, but that was the choice I made. But I am just trying to get a nice clean fold on these corners especially. And you're going to see it kind of pops up It would be prone to pop up anyways, but since I'm using a cardstock, it just makes it a little bit more prone. And that's where those clips come into play. They help hold it down while it dries. Again, if you don't have those kinds of clips, you can just put a book on top of it, and that will allow it to dry without risking the paper popping up before it's completely dried and adhered. Then I'm just repeating the process with the other cover. Again, just making sure all of my corners are lined up so that I can get a nice clean finish with it. And again, just putting those clips on to hold it together as it dries. Once dried, then I decided to measure where I wanted the overlap to be with the other color. I'm measuring this because I want it to be the same on the front and the back, and so that it has a clean finish and it matches up. So I double checked, make sure I liked where that was sitting, and then it's time to glue this all together. So I'm just adding the glue down so that I can add the second cover paper down, and just making sure I have it where it overlaps so that it will adhere really well in that area as well. One nice thing about if you were doing this, gluing this down using Modge Podge instead of a glue stick, is that you would have more working time and you could get more even coverage of glue. Again, I just didn't have enough Modge Podge to do that. I only had enough Modge Podge between the two jars to make the sketchbook. So I decided to save those for the varnishing layers and just use a glue stick for this stage. But use what you have and you just find a way to make it work. One thing I probably should have done if I wanted this to have a little bit more of a professional finish to it would be to trim down the one side of this paper that I'm folding over, because it's a little bit longer, so it's not going to have an even overlap compared to the other pages or the other edges. It's going to overlap quite a bit. I probably should have done that. It doesn't really affect the end result in the sense of like functionality. It would just make it look a little bit more polished, a little bit more finished. But I've got a 3-month-old baby at home, so I'm just happy that I could make a sketchbook. So I'm not going to be too picky. But once I glued that down, I put those clips on to hold it in place, and I did it on both covers. You may not see it at this point. I'm only really showing you one, but I did the same thing on both covers. And now I'm cutting down the inside paper. This is what's going to cover up those folded papers or those folded edges, and it's going to give our covers a nice polished finish. To get that nice polished and finished inside, I made this to be 25 centimeters by 16 centimeters. That way it wasn't too close to the edge, but you could get a nice finished result. The reason why you don't want it too close to the edge is because if it's close to the edge, then it's more prone to get like caught and peel back as you're using your sketchbook later on. So you want it to be inside just a little bit. And then I am just applying a heavy or generous amount of glue onto the cover itself and onto the paper I'm going to lay down. That way I can just make sure everything's good and adhered, because this inside paper is going to help hold all of those edges down and help make the whole cover more secure. But you can see here it goes with the paper on it, and it just cleans it up and it just makes it look a lot more finished and a little bit more professional. And I'm just pressing that down, making sure it's centered, getting all the air bubbles out. And then I'm going to be putting some heavy books on top of this while I wait for all the glue to finish curing and allow it to dry completely. And again, I did that to both covers. And once they dried completely, it was time to go in with the Modge Podge. If you're not familiar with Modge Podge, it is kind of like a sealer and a varnish all in ones. And so what it does is it protects the paper that we put on the cover. It keeps it from getting dirty. So like when you're working with pastels, you get pastel dust everywhere. And if I didn't have a protective varnish on this paper, then the cover paper would get filthy and really, really dirty, because as I'm working with pastels, it would just smudge all over the cover. So by putting this protective varnish on it, it makes it so I can just wipe that cover clean and it will always look nice. The other thing is this Modge Podge is going to help add structure and strength to our covers. So they're going to be more durable. It's going to make that paper adhere down really, really well so that it doesn't get peeled up as easily. It's going to make it so our covers don't bend and warp super easily and just make it a better and a more durable finish. I'm using a brush for this. A craft sponge is better. You're going to get a smoother finish. One thing I did do was I made sure all my brush strokes were going in one direction. That way it just gives it a little bit nicer of a finish, especially because these brush strokes will be more visible. Again, you can go as precise and pristine with this as you want. For me, it's a sketchbook, and it wasn't worth going to the store to buy a craft sponge. So I'm just using a paintbrush and just being as careful as I can. After that front side dried, I let it dry for about 40 minutes. I flipped it over and then I started doing a layer of Modge Podge on the back side. Now you'll notice that my perfectly flat covers went from flat to curved, and that is pretty common. And that's because there's uneven tension on our paper. So we put varnish on one side and it's now allowed to dry, but there's not varnish on the other side to balance it out. So that's what we're doing now. The warp and bend will still be there for a little bit, but as we do each layer and it will balance out and become flat. But I'm just being careful with my brush strokes on this. I'm not being fussy when I first put the glue down. I'm just trying to get it on there evenly, and then finishing up with just doing very directional brush strokes and having them be nice and smooth. And then I'm going to set that aside to dry. So now we're going to do an optional step, and that is to add packing tape to the edge of the glassine that's going to be bound with the coils. When I first made my soft pastel sketchbooks, I found that the glassine was prone to getting torn out accidentally out of the sketchbook. Some of that is because I overfilled my sketchbook. I had too many papers for the size of coil I was using, and I had installed the coil in backwards. So those were factors that played into it, but still I found that if I was going to take my sketchbook in my backpack or on vacation as I travel, do different things, the glassine was just more prone to being torn out. And so if I added a little bit of packing tape to the side that was going to have the holes punched through it, that problem completely disappeared. So for me, it's worth this extra step to take the glassine off, put on a little bit of the tape, fold it down nicely, and then reline it up with the pastel paper. Just because if I'm going through the effort to make a sketchbook, I want it to be durable. I want it to withstand what I'm using it for. For me, functionality supersedes aesthetics. I know that's kind of ironic being an artist, but for me, I need this to function. So another way to make this a smoother process when making and to function better is by making sure each glassine sheet lines up with the paper that it's protecting. So it is worth it to me to take this glassine off, put that tape on, and then reline it up and tape it down to the paper it's corresponding with. That way, even if there's slight variations from the holes that I punch, the glassine will line up with the individual paper, and that will help protect it better. So you see these numbers 1 through 12 and the little knobs underneath. The knobs underneath control whether it punches a hole or not, and you can punch up to 12 holes at once, and there is a center line in this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a practice sheet of paper that is the same dimensions as my pastel paper, not the cover, but the pastel paper, and I'm going to center it up and see if I like the whole arrangement, if it's centered, if I like the way it looks, and then I'm going to go from there. So what I did is I double checked with my practice paper, and then it was time to start punching holes into my pastel paper. And I even put a piece of masking tape up on that corner just to make sure everything stays aligned. And then another thing I did to help make sure everything lines up and all of my papers will line up within the sketchbook as much as possible was I put 2 pieces of masking tape on the right hand side of my Cinch machine. You can see them over the numbers, and that just allowed me to line up my papers and have them centered every time I put them in, because they have this ruler in the middle, and it even has a straight side so that you can line up your papers with it. But because my papers are so small, they don't get to line up on that edge. And so by putting those 2 little pieces of tape on that right hand side allowed me to line it up every time. So it just sped up the process, and it will make how the papers stack up within the sketchbook more even. And the reason why I say to base your holes that you're going to punch and your center line based off of the inside paper is because it's smaller. And if you base it off of the cover, what happens is then your pastel paper isn't centered on the cover, or you run the risk of accidentally punching an extra hole because your cover's so big that your paper might end up having a half hole that isn't centered, or your paper might be shifted. It's just a lot easier to base it off of that smaller paper. But once those pastel papers and the glassine papers had their holes punched, I stacked them up and set them to the side, and then I started working on punching the holes for the cover. So I did a practice test, make sure I liked how it lined up with that, figured out where the center point was for the cover, and then I punched the hole for the covers. Now, the Modge Podge had dried on these covers for about an hour, 2 hours at this point, so they weren't completely cured, but they were dry enough that I could easily handle them. Now, one thing you'll notice when I punched the holes for the covers, I actually did one cover facing up and the other one facing down. And that's because that is the way they're going to line up once it's all bound anyways. And so this will reduce any kind of errors with it not lining up perfectly, because I am not exact on this. We addressed it. I'm just kind of eyeball it and going off of feels. So by having them face each other the way they're going to be bound, just reduces any errors where the covers might not be straight or line up perfectly. Then it was time to start on the varnishing coats. We're in the home stretch, but also the longest stretch. This is the most time-consuming aspect of the project, is doing the finishing varnishing coats. I did 5 coats per side on each cover. So 5 coats on the fronts and 5 coats on the back. So this right now is the second coat. And you'll see I'll switch to a different kind of Modge Podge, and there's no explicit reason for that. It's just I only had enough Modge Podge in each one together to create one sketchbook. And so I did one coat with the glossy finish, and then I decided I wanted to have a glossy finish for this, and I only had enough for one more glossy finish coat, so I used the other one for the middle layers. But I did a layer of the Modge Podge, let it dry, flipped it over, and then did another layer on the back side, and I did it back and forth like that until there was 5 coats each. The reason why I did it in this order was because I wanted a layer of Modge Podge down to really hold all the papers down well before I punched the holes, so I didn't risk anything getting peeled up or anything like that. And then by having those holes punched for the other layers of Modge Podge, then that Modge Podge could get into those little holes that I punched and seal up that paper on the inside and just allow those holes to be a little bit more durable for the life of the sketchbook. But the rest of it is just the same, just back and forth brush strokes, making it nice and smooth, letting them dry, and then doing another layer. With Modge Podge, as long as you're doing thinner coats, you can do a new coat about every 20 to 30 minutes. Once it dries clear, you can do another coat. Then I cut out my coil to size. So I counted out how many holes were punched into my sketchbook. Then I cut out a coil for each hole, and then I trimmed the wire to size. And that's what it looks like finished. And then there's a weird scalloped edge on the Cinch machine, and that's where you line up your coils to allow you to put all of your paper and everything on it. So I put that on there, hung it on the edge, and then it's time to put the paper on. And this is really important how you layer it. So when you're doing it, you want to put your back cover on first, and you want it to have it the right side up. Then you put your front cover, so the nice one that you want to have be on the front, you put that second and you have it facing down. So the two correct outside edges are facing each other. Then you put your pastel paper on and you do it facing downward. So you want the sanded side to face those covers. And you want to look at the back side of paper as you layer it. This is really important because if you accidentally do it backwards, your sketchbook won't open and close as nicely. So believe me, because I ended up accidentally doing it wrong this time, even though I know how to do it, I still flip it in my mind and I had to redo it because the sketchbook doesn't open and close as nicely and it's a little bit more frustrating. This is where keeping your glassine paper lined up with your pastel paper is also beneficial because when you are putting it onto those coil rings, it's really easy to accidentally miss one of the loops with the glassine. And so it just makes it a lot faster to put it all on if they're all together. Then I pulled off the coil, kept all the papers and everything centered onto it, and then it was time to do the press aspect of the cinch machine. So on this back side is where the press is. That knob adjusts how much it's going to press it down, so you can do an inch, half inch. Each of those little teardrops has a measurement. What you want to do is make sure you're pressing it to where the coils, like the more rectangular and the more oval ones, are about touching, like that. That way your papers don't accidentally fall off. And then I'm just finishing up the edges of the wires by folding them down. That way nothing can get snagged and it just looks a little bit more finished and a little bit more polished. So earlier when I made the cover, I talked about how I made the cover 2 centimeters wider and 2 centimeters longer than the paper on the inside. And I mentioned that you might want to only make it 1.5 centimeters longer earlier, and this is where you can see it because everything has to line up on the coil, and I forgot to account for that this time when I made the sketchbook. And so there's a little bit more of an overhang of the cover on the side opposite of the coil. If you are someone that likes everything to be even and perfectly lined up, you'll want to account for that. With it being a little bit longer, it doesn't affect how the sketchbook functions, and it provides a little bit more protection of the papers on the inside. So I'm not too worried. But that is the finished sketchbook. If you found this helpful and informative, please hit the like button. If you want to see more of what I create, please hit the follow button. If you have any questions about this or anything else I've done, please leave them down below and I'll do my best to answer them. I hope you have a great day and I'll see you next time. Bye.